The world watched as two storms rose over the same horizon, one roaring in chaos, the other breathing a deadly stillness. Together, they spelled the unraveling of a power that once dared to call itself unbreakable. Behind the walls of offices and war rooms, a plan older than ambition itself began to crumble, not with bombs or battles, but with silence sharp enough to cut steel. In Moscow, they called it Fortress West, the pride of a nation built on defiance. For years, it was painted as proof of eternal strength, a city armory on the edge of Europe, the dagger in NATO's heart. Its name carried the echo of triumph. Kaliningrad. It was not merely a place, it was a promise. The promise that Russia's reach could not be contained, that its shadow would stretch unbroken from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and for a time, that illusion held. But power has a cruel way of hiding its own weakness. Kaliningrad's brilliance, its fleets and missiles, its iron presence, all floated on a single fragile lifeline, a thread of steel and fuel stretching across Lithuania's rails. That lifeline was the pulse of the fortress, pumping oil, supplies, and faith into the veins of a city that had no land of its own. Without it, the dagger would rust in its sheath. Without it, the myth would fade into dust. For years, Moscow ignored the risk. Pride does that, it blinds kings and generals alike. Yet far beyond the noise of propaganda, quiet minds in Washington and London began to draw a new kind of weapon. Not one made of fire, but of law. Not one that shouted, but one that whispered commands through the arteries of the global economy. On October 23, 2025, that whisper became a roar. The US Treasury and the British government unveiled their new creation secondary sanctions, a phrase so sterile, so bureaucratic, it barely seemed dangerous. But beneath its legal language lay a blade honed by decades of financial warfare. Any company, any bank, anywhere in the world that dared to trade with Russia's energy titans, Ross and Lukoil, would be cut off from the dollar and sterling systems. No loans, no trade, no breath. It was not a missile strike, yet it hit harder than any weapon. Because for the first time, Moscow's enemies did not aim at soldiers, they aimed at the arteries of the empire itself. In Vilnius, the government of Lithuania read the document and felt the weight of an impossible choice. They were the bridge carrying Russia's oil to Kaliningrad, the silent lifeline. Now, that bridge stood over a pit of fire. On one side, loyalty to NATO's creed and survival within the Western financial world. On the other, the risk of feeding fuel into Putin's fortress, defying the sanctions, and being cast out like a pariah. It took them only days to decide. On October 31st, Lithuania spoke with the calm of those who know their decision will echo through history. Beginning November 20, first, no more oil, no more fuel, no more lifeblood to Kaliningrad. In a single decree, they did what decades of military confrontation could not. They strangled Russia's unsinkable carrier. Behind Kremlin walls, rage flickered like lightning trapped in glass. But fury could not fix what finance had frozen. Putin's pride was trapped by paper and pen, by contracts and codes, by the invisible walls of the world's banking system. He could not threaten a banknote. He could not invade a spreadsheet. He could not order tanks against a treasury document. His empire had met a new kind of enemy, one that fought not with armies, but with algorithms and signatures. Lithuania's railway, once a symbol of compromise, became a weapon. The figures told a merciless story. 371,000 tons of fuel had flowed through it in 2024, almost all belonging to Lukoil. That was the oxygen of Kaliningrad's ships, the diesel of its tanks, the warmth of its homes. On November 21st, that oxygen would be gone. Inside the Kremlin, the silence was heavier than any explosion. Putin had built his myth on the theater of strength, the parades, the missiles, the maps with red arrows. Yet this was a war he could neither parade nor predict. A fortress that could withstand armies was now helpless before an accountant's pen. A fleet that could strike NATO's coasts could not move without Western fuel. An empire that had mastered propaganda now faced a truth it could not rewrite. And so the dagger that once pointed proudly toward Europe began to corrode, still sharp in shape but hollow at its core. The myth of invincibility cracked quietly beneath the weight of numbers and sanctions. That was how it began, the slow suffocation of a fortress once called unsinkable. A nation that believed it ruled through fear was now learning what true fear felt like. Not the sound of missiles, but the silence after the fuel runs dry. It was the first act in a war without soldiers, the first chapter in a battle fought not on fields but in ledgers, and though no one yet realized it, the fall of Kaliningrad would not end there. It was only the first pulse of something greater, a storm of strategy, deception, and retribution that would soon engulf the entire western front of a crumbling empire. It began with the quietest execution in modern history. No bullets, no fire, just a signature that turned a fortress into a ghost. While Moscow tried to roar, the world answered with silence sharp enough to bleed through steel. Kaliningrad, the unsinkable aircraft carrier, the pride of Russian might, was no longer a dagger aimed at the heart of Europe. It was a stranded relic, cut off, powerless, suffocating. Putin had long called it his miracle. His people called it his revenge. A fortress that mocked NATO's borders, home to the Baltic Fleet and its nuclear teeth. Yet the truth that no propaganda could bury was now bare. The miracle had no legs of its own. Its lifeline had always run through Lithuania. One railway, one fragile chain linking empire to illusion, and now that chain had snapped. In the Kremlin, aides whispered of alternatives, of Plan B trucks, they said, roads through Belarus, a route that bypassed Lithuania, that kept the oil flowing, that kept the myth breathing. The president listened, but beyond the borders, another hand was already closing the second lock. At that same moment, while Lithuania's decree silenced Kaliningrad's railway, the border with Belarus caught fire not in explosions, but in chaos. Balloons, yes, balloons drifting across the night sky, smuggling cigarettes and secrets. What had once been a petty nuisance suddenly became a national threat. The Lithuanian Prime Minister called it hybrid warfare, a silent attack orchestrated from Minsk. And within days, Lithuania did what it had never dared before. It sealed its crossings with Belarus. Two borders, two arteries, both cut within the same week. Coincidence? No. Coordination so precise it felt surgical. The man behind those balloons, Alexander Lukashenko, dictator of Belarus and Putin's last friend in Europe, had played with fire too long. He believed he could dance between East and West, make himself indispensable, bargain his way into safety, but the game he thought he controlled had turned on him. The smuggling crisis was no accident. It was a trap set in motion by his own hubris, his own belief that chaos made him powerful. As the borders closed, Lukashenko panicked. His country's veins tightened, trade slowed to a crawl. The roads to Poland and Lithuania, his only doors to the west, were suddenly locked. His fantasy of leverage evaporated, and as the world laughed at his balloons, he realized too late that the strings were in someone else's hands. Behind closed doors, Western intelligence had already mapped this move months ahead. They knew that when Russia's oil lines were severed, Moscow would reach for Belarus. They knew Putin's Plan B was a convoy of trucks through Minsk's roads, and they knew exactly how to kill it legally, surgically, without a single soldier stepping forward. The smuggling operation gave them the pretext, the sanction gave them the power. Lithuania and Poland closed their gates, citing national security. What Russia called friendship, NATO called containment. Kaliningrad's isolation was now total. No fuel by rail, no fuel by road, only a cold, choking quiet. Putin's dagger was bleeding without a single gunshot fired. Inside the Kremlin, the fury was almost theatrical. But fury couldn't melt the steel walls of reality. The railway belonged to Lithuania, the roads belonged to Poland, the sanctions belonged to Washington and London. For once, the empire had no cards to play. It was a masterpiece of modern warfare, one fought not with tanks but with timing. On one side, the noise of politics, speeches, and bluster. On the other, the precision of financial and legal warfare. Together, They formed a vice that tightened around Putin's western flank until every escape route snapped shut, and the beauty or cruelty of it all was that it was done openly, legally, in the name of compliance. There were no secret agents, no invasions, no hidden bombs, just paperwork, signatures, and borders quietly closing one after another. Kaliningrad's pride turned to paralysis. Its port still held ships, but no fuel to move them. Its soldiers still stood guard, but no supplies to feed them. The once mighty Baltic fleet now floated like a trapped beast, roaring inside an invisible cage. To the Russian people, the Kremlin broadcast calm. They spoke of temporary disruptions, of Western deceit, of endurance. But in the offices behind the curtains, panic pulsed like a second heartbeat. Because they knew this was not a temporary blockade. This was a dismantling of strategy itself, a removal of options so complete that even desperation found no path forward. For the first time, Putin's doctrine built on fear, speed, and aggression met an enemy that didn't move, a war that could not be fought with soldiers, a conflict waged through silence, legality, and the slow tightening of invisible hands. He could not command a missile to strike a law. He could not threaten a tank against a treaty. He could not undo what had already been sealed with the stroke of a pen. In a single week, Russia's Western dream had collapsed into a logistical nightmare. And though no explosions thundered across Europe, the sound of that collapse was deafening to those who knew how to listen. The fortress had not been attacked. It had been abandoned by its own arteries. And now, as the oil tanks drained and the engines cooled, one truth stood like a blade in the dark. Power that cannot move, cannot survive. Kaliningrad, once the crown of defiance, was now the monument of a fading empire. And somewhere deep inside that empire, its architect began to understand he was not losing a city. He was losing time itself. He had built his empire on control, and now control was slipping through his fingers like ash. Alexander Lukashenko, the last man still daring to call himself Putin's brother-in-arms, woke to a reality more fragile than his own shadow. The borders were sealed, the trade routes dead, and the silence around him was not peace, it was the silence before a collapse. For years, he had walked a tightrope between power and betrayal, smiling east while whispering west. He believed himself clever, the survivor, the negotiator, the one man who could dance between two burning worlds and never get burned. He sold loyalty to Moscow while hinting at reconciliation to Washington. He toyed with both, mistaking his balancing act for brilliance. But every illusion has its deadline, and his came wrapped in smoke and humiliation. The smuggling balloons, the very symbol of his arrogance, became his undoing. What began as petty cigarette contraband spiraled into an international crisis. Lithuania called it a hybrid attack. Poland followed suit. Within hours, both countries closed their borders to Belarus, branding the balloons as weapons of subversion. Lukashenko's grand design, his backdoor to the west, his escape route from the Kremlin's grip, was crushed under his own deceit. On paper, it looked like border management. In truth, it was a guillotine dressed as policy. His roads to the west were gone, and with them, his leverage. The irony burned like poison. He had built the smuggling empire that justified his own isolation. Inside his government, fear began to leak through the walls. Ministers whispered of shortages, truck lines, hunger. His people could no longer move, trade, or breathe beyond the cage he'd built. The country that once called itself Russia's shield had become a prison without gates. Lukashenko tried to mask panic with rage. He went on state television, his face trembling between fury and desperation, accusing everyone, the Americans, the Poles, even the wind. But no one was listening. The West saw a cornered tyrant. Moscow saw a liability. And for the first time, his shouts echoed into nothing. He had once dreamed of a grand bargain, a secret deal with the United States. He would turn his back on Putin, release political prisoners, and in return, have sanctions lifted. He spoke of it to his aides as the redemption plan. But redemption demands credibility, and he had already sold his to the highest bidder. That dream shattered on the same week the borders closed. When Lithuania and Poland sealed their crossings, they didn't just trap his economy, they trapped his soul. The man who believed he could betray one empire to join another found himself rejected by both. Desperation made him clumsy. He tried one last move, a trade that reeked of surrender. He offered Poland the most valuable political prisoner in Belarus, Andrzej Poczobut, a man Poland had long fought to free. In exchange, he begged for one thing: open a single border crossing, one gate, one exit. But the answer was colder than any sanction. Poland said no. They used the same words he once wielded: national security, hybrid attack, sovereignty. The door stayed shut. He had gambled his last card, and it vanished in his own hands. The dictator who once mocked Western weakness now begged for access to its mercy. The ally who once boasted of standing shoulder to shoulder with Putin now found himself isolated, unwanted, and humiliated. Even Moscow grew quiet, too quiet. Because Russia knew what this meant. The Union State, the Great Alliance, the twin pillar of Russian-Belarusian unity was cracking. The illusion that Russia could protect its ally, that Moscow's shadow could shield Minsk from Western power, was gone. Putin could not save him, not this time. As his borders froze and his economy suffocated, Lukashenko began to spiral. His speeches became incoherent, bursts of contradiction, part plea, part threat, part confession. One moment, he cursed the West for betrayal. The next, he begged for negotiations. One sentence promised loyalty to Putin, the next exposed his fear of being abandoned by him. It was the unraveling of a man who had built his rule on duplicity and suddenly found no one left to deceive. According to leaks from his own inner circle, he ranted to American diplomats for a public apology over the balloon accusations. His voice cracked. He accused everyone, even his supposed allies, of conspiring to destroy him. And in a sense, he was right. They didn't need to invade. They only had to close the doors and watch him implode. He had dreamed of being the clever survivor in a world of giants. Instead, he became the living proof that giants devour those who pretend to stand beside them. By the end of October, his government was breaking down in real time. The economy stalled, trade vanished, public faith decayed. The once feared leader was reduced to a desperate man screaming into a void, demanding apologies from the same powers he had courted in secret. And through it all, the cameras kept rolling, capturing not the rise of a savior, but the collapse of a schemer. Lukashenko, once the loudest voice of defiance, had become a symbol of something far more haunting, a man trapped in the cage he built for others. He was no longer Putin's ally, no longer the West's negotiator. He was a relic, floating between two collapsing worlds, suffocating in a silence louder than any war. He was a man once feared for his ruthlessness, now feared for his unraveling. Alexander Lukashenko no longer ruled, he reacted. Every word he spoke betrayed the tremor of a cornered beast who could sense the cage closing. His empire, once built on iron control, was dissolving in chaos, and the world could see it. The microphones that had once magnified his dominance now amplified his panic. His speeches no longer inspired fear, they exposed it. The strongman who once mocked Western leaders as weaklings now begged them for mercy, demanded their apologies, cursed them for indifference, and then, moments later, pleaded for negotiation. The contradictions were dizzying. His tone swung between rage and despair, loyalty and betrayal, war and surrender. Lukashenko's mind had become a battlefield where his fears fought his pride, and every word that left his mouth wounded him more than his enemies ever could. Behind closed doors, the truth was no longer a secret, not in Minsk, not in Moscow, not in Washington. Lukashenko had lost everything, his leverage, his credibility, his sanity. The man who once prided himself on controlling chaos was now its prisoner. His greatest terror was not the West's sanctions, it was irrelevance. He had lived too long believing that he was indispensable to both sides, that neither Russia nor NATO could move a step without glancing at him. But the world had stopped looking. He was shouting in an empty theater, performing for an audience that had already left. Every outburst was a confession, Every accusation revealed a truth he couldn't face, that he was no longer part of the game. When the Belarusian opposition leaked his latest rant, the footage went viral within hours. In it, Lukashenko slammed his fist, accused the Americans of betrayal, demanded that they publicly apologize for humiliating him over the balloon crisis. His voice cracked, his eyes wide with disbelief that the world he'd manipulated for so long now mocked him in return. It was not the anger of a dictator, it was the humiliation of a man who finally realized he was the last to understand the rules had changed. For decades, Lukashenko had built his power on his proximity to Putin. He was the shield of Russia's western flank, the brother state that gave Moscow an extra wall against NATO. But now, that wall was cracking, and Putin, fighting his own war of survival, had no hands left to hold it together. Belarus had become the echo of Russia's weakness, a country suffocating under the same weight of sanctions, isolation, and false pride. The so-called Union State that Moscow had celebrated as the cornerstone of Eurasian strength now looked like a collapsing stage set, its two actors forgetting their lines, shouting contradictions into the dark. Lukashenko tried to prove his loyalty, even as panic chewed at the edges of his composure. He repeated Kremlin talking points like a broken record. Ukraine started the war, the West was aggressive, Russia was misunderstood, but the words came out hollow. They no longer convinced anyone, not even himself. The world saw a desperate man trying to convince his jailer that he was still useful. The Kremlin saw something worse: weakness. The more Lukashenko spoke, the more isolated he became. His generals looked away, his ministers remained silent. Even the Russian state media, once eager to amplify his defiance, began to distance themselves. Moscow could sense the stench of failure, and no empire embraces a sinking ally for long. In the West, analysts began calling him Putin's hostage, not ally, not partner, hostage, a title that fit too perfectly, because that was exactly what he had become, trapped between loyalty and betrayal, crushed by a war he didn't start and a peace he couldn't buy. He had wanted to betray Putin quietly, to hand over secrets and deals to the Americans in exchange for freedom. But now, even betrayal was denied to him. The West had closed its doors, Putin had tightened his grip, and Lukashenko was left to rot between two collapsing worlds. In one of his final televised addresses of October, he tried to project strength, announcing that Belarus had completed work on deploying new hypersonic missiles, the pride of Russian technology. But even that boast was a confession. His tone betrayed him. It was not confidence, but fear. He was reading a script written by Moscow, a script meant to remind the world that he still mattered. But the world knew better. The show was over. The actor was reciting lines to an empty hall. In his desperation, Lukashenko became unpredictable, a liability to both sides. The West saw instability, Putin saw danger, and in geopolitics, danger without control is always the first to be sacrificed. That was the paradox that destroyed him. He tried to prove his strength through noise, and the noise only revealed his collapse. His speeches became viral for all the wrong reasons, not as declarations of power, but as symbols of decay. Commentators across Europe began to call him the mirror of Moscow, because his madness reflected Putin's own unraveling. For every sentence he shouted, the world saw a prophecy that the empire he represented was losing its breath, its discipline, its fear. Lukashenko had become what he had once despised most, a warning, not to his enemies, but to his allies. He was still standing, but everyone could see it. The fall had already begun. It arrived like a whisper that carried the weight of a war. A single document, 4,400 pages long, leaked to the world on November 1st. No explosions, no invasions, no declarations, just paper. But within those pages lay the quiet confession of a truth that would shake every border of Europe. The war had already begun. It was called the Eastern Front Deterrence Line concept, a masterpiece of strategy authored not by a politician, but by a soldier who understood the anatomy of fear. NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Christopher Donahue, The plan spoke of Phase Zero, not a battle, not a defense, but a doctrine, a way to win wars before they even start. For decades, NATO had waited, reacting, retreating, rebuilding after every shock. But this time, the alliance did not wait for the storm. It became the storm. Phase Zero meant preemption, the art of striking without firing, disarming without detonating, suffocating without killing. It meant dismantling an enemy's will before dismantling his weapons. And in that single concept lay the blueprint for everything that had just unfolded: the cutting of Kaliningrad's oil veins, the closing of Belarus's borders, the economic strangulation of an empire that still believed war meant tanks and missiles. The West had changed its definition of power, and Russia hadn't noticed until it was already trapped inside it. While Putin's generals rehearsed parades and painted maps of imagined conquests, the accountants, lawyers, and diplomats of the West were rewriting the rules of combat. Their arsenal was law, their weapon was coordination, their battlefield the arteries of logistics and finance. Phase Zero did not aim to destroy armies. It aimed to make them irrelevant. The plan had been years in the making, born out of the mistakes of Crimea, of Syria, of Ukraine. NATO's intelligence services had watched, learned, and adapted, and now, with one silent maneuver, they had executed what military textbooks would one day call the perfect chokehold. Kaliningrad was the first victim. The so-called fortress, once imagined as Russia's dagger in NATO's heart, had been gutted without a single missile, its oil cut off by sanctions, its land routes closed by law, its resupply routes turned into traps, its soldiers, still armed, now useless. The dagger had become a rusted blade. Belarus was the second. Lukashenko, the self-proclaimed survivor, had been neutralized, not through invasion, but humiliation. His own chaos weapon, the smuggling balloons, had provided NATO the legal justification to shut his borders, freeze his trade, and turn his regime inward against itself. His loyalty to Putin had turned from shield to shackle. Together, these two collapses formed the living definition of Phase Zero. It was deterrence not by threat, but by inevitability. The moment Putin moved westward, the trap had already been sprung. NATO didn't have to fire, it only had to close the valves. General Donohue's leaked document read like prophecy. After the war in Ukraine ends, it warned, the risk of a Russian strike against NATO will reach its peak. And so, before that moment could arrive, the alliance moved first. The Baltic front was reinforced, the financial front was activated, and the psychological front, the quietest and most devastating of all, began dismantling Putin's myth of invincibility. Phase Zero was not just military, it was existential. It told the world that modern warfare would no longer be fought on land or sea, but in the invisible corridors of economy, legality, and influence. It turned Putin's greatest pride, his army, into his greatest burden. While Moscow's state television celebrated its missiles, NATO had already neutralized the fuel to launch them. While Russia boasted of its fleets, NATO had turned the Baltic Sea into a surveillance grid where every ship was a shadow under watch. And while Putin spoke of sovereignty, his fortress in Kaliningrad was being slowly starved by the very borders he once mocked as weak. It was elegant, ruthless, inevitable. Putin's Western doctrine, built on intimidation and expansion, was collapsing under the weight of its own illusions. The empire that once prided itself on unpredictability had been outmaneuvered by a plan written in plain sight. And still, the most haunting part of the revelation wasn't the military detail, it was the timing. The entire sequence of events, from Lithuania's oil embargo to the closure of Belarus's crossings, had unfolded before the doctrine was even publicly known. By the time the world read the plan, it had already succeeded. That was the genius of Phase Zero. While Putin raged and Lukashenko begged, NATO's operation was already complete. The oil had stopped. The corridors were sealed. The fortress and its ally had been neutralized, not in war, but in logic. Phase Zero was not a battle strategy. It was an evolution of civilization, the proof that the modern empire would fall not through destruction, but through disconnection. In the quiet corridors of Brussels, Washington, and London, they did not celebrate with cheers or flags. They simply closed their laptops, knowing that the first war of the 21st century had ended before the first shot was fired. And somewhere in Moscow, beneath the weight of his own silence, Vladimir Putin finally realized his fortress had fallen, his ally was breaking, and the war he thought was still coming had already been lost. It was the sound of a fortress drowning not in water, but in silence. Kaliningrad, once hailed as the unsinkable crown of Russian pride, had become a still monument to defeat. The dagger that Putin promised to keep forever at NATO's throat was now buried in his own chest, its fuel gone, its fleet frozen, its glory turned to ash. For years, the Russian people had been told that Kaliningrad was untouchable, the proof of their greatness, the symbol of their reach. They were taught to believe it was the empire's western sword, the eye watching Europe. But the truth had always been cruel. Kaliningrad was never a sword, only a limb stretched too far from the body, surviving on borrowed breath. Now that breath was gone. When Lithuania cut the oil lines, it did not just sever a supply route, it exposed a lie. The fortress had no ground beneath its feet, and when Poland and Lithuania sealed the borders of Belarus, they closed the last door Russia could have used to feed it. 2 acts, 1 week, and an entire doctrine of power collapsed without a single shot. The unsinkable fortress was starving, its tanks stood silent, its aircraft grounded, its navy imprisoned by geography. Every ship that tried to move now faced a circle of NATO eyes: Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Poland, a lake of enemies watching every ripple. The Baltic Sea had become NATO's glass cage, and inside it, Russia's proud Baltic fleet was trapped like a relic of a forgotten age. To resupply Kaliningrad by sea would now mean suicide. Every tanker, every vessel leaving St. Petersburg for the enclave would have to pass through a corridor surrounded by nations bound by the same pact. The route that once symbolized defiance now screamed vulnerability. 1 sanction, 1 inspection, 1 order, and the ships would stop moving altogether. Putin's fortress was no longer an asset, it was a liability, a frozen chess piece on a board he could no longer control. Inside Russia, the illusion cracked like old glass. The generals who had boasted of Kaliningrad's invincibility now avoided mentioning its name. Analysts on state television hesitated, their voices trembling with rehearsed optimism that fooled no one. The public had been fed a legend for 20 years that Russia could strike NATO whenever it wished, that it stood unshaken in the face of Western pressure. But now, for the first time, the people saw that even their myths could starve. Every empire eventually meets its moment of awakening, that cruel second when it realizes that fear can no longer feed it. For Putin, that moment was Kaliningrad. He had built his strategy on intimidation, on the spectacle of might, on the belief that Western democracies would always hesitate. But NATO's new doctrine, Phase Zero, had rewritten the rule. The alliance did not respond. It preempted. It did not threaten. It dismantled. Putin's nuclear rhetoric, his parade of missiles and speeches, now sounded like echoes from an obsolete world. The new battlefield wasn't land or sea, it was infrastructure, trade, finance, the unseen veins that kept his empire alive. NATO hadn't invaded him, it had unplugged him. The consequences rippled far beyond Kaliningrad. In every Russian military base west of Moscow, officers whispered questions they never dared to ask aloud. If the West could choke Kaliningrad in a week, what could it do to the rest of them? What good were weapons if the fuel tanks were dry? What good were soldiers if the supply lines belonged to someone else? The fall of Kaliningrad was not a defeat in battle, it was the death of a philosophy. For decades, Putin had promised the Russian people that the empire could live outside the global order, that it could create its own world, untouched by Western control. But now, even the most patriotic citizens could see the truth. Their strength was chained to the systems they had mocked. Kaliningrad's collapse was a message written in silence that no fortress built on pride can survive when the world turns its back. And as the enclave suffocated under its own isolation, the second pillar of Putin's Western dream, the union state with Belarus began to crumble beside it. The brotherhood he once sold as eternal had revealed itself to be hollow. Belarus was suffocating, its leader begging for mercy, its borders sealed by the same nations that had just strangled Kaliningrad. Lukashenko's desperation, his trembling pleas to reopen crossings, his erratic declarations of loyalty, they were not just signs of a man collapsing. They were reflections of the empire collapsing with him. Putin had promised the Russian people that he would make the West kneel. Instead, the world was watching him lose everything he had built, not through war, but through a quiet, methodical undoing. And in that silence, a realization spread like a chill across the corridors of Moscow. The fortress was gone, the alliance was broken, and the future he had sworn to control was no longer his to command. He had sold his people an empire. Now, they were watching it die on live television. The collapse of Russia's Western strategy was no longer a rumor, whispered in corridors. It was a spectacle broadcast in real time. Putin's fortress, his alliance, his myth, all unraveling in front of the very nation he swore would rise again. Kaliningrad was finished. The unsinkable city he'd called Russia's dagger in Europe had become a stranded relic, drained of oil, dependent on foreign grace for survival. The mighty Baltic fleet, once paraded as the guardian of the West, was now nothing more than a museum of floating steel. Its ships still gleamed, its flags still waved, but beneath the illusion lay paralysis. They could not sail, could not fight, could not even refuel without crossing seas now owned by NATO eyes. The Russian people, long fed on visions of invincibility, began to understand. The dagger was not in NATO's heart, it was in Russia's own chest, and Belarus, the brother nation, the second pillar of the great Union state, had fallen into the same trap. Lukashenko, the man once hailed as Putin's shield, was now the clearest proof that loyalty to Moscow offered no protection. His borders sealed, his economy gasping, his political control cracking, he had become the image of desperation. When he begged Poland to reopen the crossings, offering his most prized hostage as a bargaining chip, it was not strategy. It was surrender dressed in protocol. Even Putin's most loyal supporters could no longer deny what they saw. The Union state, that shining promise of a new superpower, was hollow, a slogan built on dependency, not unity. The Kremlin, usually so masterful at spinning defeat into glory, struggled to find words. How do you explain to a nation that its dagger has dulled, its shield has shattered, and its empire is now being choked by paperwork? Television hosts who once barked about Western weakness now paused before reading the teleprompter. Analysts fumbled for metaphors. Generals disappeared from interviews. The silence spoke louder than propaganda ever could. Inside Russia's elite circles, fear began to mutate into blame. Some whispered that the West had cheated, that NATO's Phase Zero doctrine wasn't war, it was sorcery. Others muttered that the Kremlin had underestimated the world, relying too much on spectacle and too little on substance. But none dared say aloud the simplest truth: the empire had been outplayed. The fall of Kaliningrad was more than a logistical defeat, it was psychological collapse. For decades, Putin had anchored his image in strength. Now, that image was a portrait of helplessness. He had built his power on the belief that Russia could outlast sanctions, outthink NATO, and outfight anyone who defied it. Yet his greatest stronghold had been neutralized by a document. His greatest ally had been silenced by a border closure. The people who once saw him as the rebuilder of Russia were beginning to see the cracks. The parades, the military anthems, the speeches about destiny, they now felt like echoes from another era. In the digital haze of state news, reality seeped through. The empire was bleeding out in silence. For years, Putin's propaganda machine had repeated the same mantra: "We are encircled, but unbroken." Now the truth was harder to hide. They were not encircled by tanks, but by laws. Not by armies, but by logistics. And in this kind of war, their tanks were meaningless. The symbolism was devastating. Kaliningrad, once the jewel of defiance, now survived only on what NATO allowed it to have. Belarus, the loyal ally, was begging for mercy from the very enemies it had been taught to despise. Together, they stood as monuments to an empire that could no longer protect even its closest friends. Putin had dreamed of pushing NATO back to the Cold War's borders. Instead, NATO had advanced without firing a single shot. Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Poland, Germany, the nations that once trembled, now surrounded him in quiet unity. The Baltic, once Russia's gateway, had become a NATO lake. Inside that reality, even the Kremlin's most devoted propagandists felt the shift. The word victory had vanished from their tongues. The tone had changed from defiance to damage control. The slogans grew softer, the excuses longer. The myth was collapsing under its own weight. Putin had promised his people a return to greatness, a revival of power, a restoration of pride. But now, the nation that feared him most was no longer abroad. It was his own. They watched as his empire, built on the illusion of control, disintegrated piece by piece, undone not by invasion, but by exposure. And the most haunting truth of all was that it happened without resistance. No dramatic final stand, no grand betrayal, just a slow, deliberate suffocation orchestrated by enemies who never needed to lift a weapon. The people had once believed that their leader could bend the world to his will. Now they saw the truth written in every closed port, every stranded ship, every unanswered threat the world had bent him instead. The dagger was gone, the shield was broken, and the silence that followed was louder than war. It ended not with fire, but with silence, the kind of silence that follows the end of an empire. In just 1 week, Putin's Western world had collapsed, not through invasion or rebellion, but through precision, patience, and inevitability. The stage he had built for his grand show of strength had become the scene of his humiliation. NATO's doctrine, Phase Zero, had done what decades of conflict could not. It had stripped the empire bare. No armies marched, no bombs fell, yet everything he had built in the West was gone. Kaliningrad, the dagger, the fortress, the eternal symbol of defiance, now lay still, its fuel gone, its fleet stranded, its pride drained like blood from a wound. And Belarus, the so-called brotherhood, the second pillar of Putin's Western dream, was suffocating in the same trap, its leader reduced to begging and denial. The myth had died, and the world had watched it die in real time. The fall of Kaliningrad was more than a logistical disaster. It was the death of the lie that had held Russia together. The lie that strength could be manufactured through spectacle, that power could be sustained through fear. For 2 decades, Putin had told his people that Russia's greatness was eternal, that its reach was unstoppable. Now they watched as the last symbol of that illusion, his unsinkable fortress, ran out of breath. The numbers said it all. Fuel shipments gone, trade halted, roads sealed. The enclave was a prison wrapped in steel and sanctions, a ghost of its former legend. Even if the Navy wanted to move, it couldn't. Every route from St. Petersburg to Kaliningrad passed through NATO's lake, a ring of nations that had once trembled before Moscow, now united in quiet, unbreakable resolve. The same sea that once carried Russian might now carry its defeat. Kaliningrad's fall was not the end of a city. It was the exposure of a myth. The fortress in Europe was no fortress at all, just a stranded outpost gasping for relevance in a war fought with money, not missiles. Its isolation was total, its defeat was permanent. And alongside it, Belarus, the supposed shield of the Union state, was unraveling from within. Lukashenko's panic, his contradictions, his desperate confessions had turned him from ally to liability. The man who once boasted of being Putin's brother was now his curse, his reflection in despair. When he begged Poland to reopen the border and was refused, the world saw it for what it was, not negotiation, but humiliation. Together, the two collapses formed a mirror that Putin could no longer avoid. The first crack was strategic, the second was symbolic. But what shattered was his doctrine, the belief that power meant control, that fear could substitute for respect. The Russian people had been told for years that NATO was weak, divided, timid, but the alliance had struck with the precision of a surgeon, and the ruthlessness of inevitability. It had dismantled Putin's western flank without a single soldier crossing a line. The victory was not military, it was conceptual. For the first time, an empire that had thrived on aggression was destroyed by restraint. The weapons were laws, sanctions, borders, and silence. Inside Russia, the whisper of defeat became a roar. The people who had believed they were living in a reborn superpower began to see the cracks, the parades, the speeches, the talk of destiny. All of it now felt like theater. And in every home, the same unspoken thought began to spread. If the fortress could fall without a fight, what else could? The doctrine of fear, the foundation of Putin's power, was breaking apart. For decades, he had claimed that Russia was surrounded, that only his strength could keep the wolves away. But now the wolves had not attacked, they had waited, and the empire devoured itself. The tragedy of it all was not just geopolitical, it was personal. Putin, the man who once moved nations with a gesture, now found himself powerless before a piece of paper from Washington, a sanction from London, a border closed by Lithuania. His tanks could not roll through bank ledgers. His missiles could not silence algorithms. His threats meant nothing in a war fought through economics and law. This was the new age, the age where power was not measured in firepower, but in access. And Russia, for all its armies and arsenals, had been locked out. Kaliningrad was no longer a fortress, it was a burden, a rusting anchor tied to a sinking ship. Its fall symbolized the end of the era where war was fought with strength alone. Now, it was fought with intelligence, patience, and unity. And in that unity, NATO had found its greatest weapon. The alliance that Putin mocked as indecisive had become the architect of his undoing. The nations he had dismissed as cowards had written the first chapter of a new kind of warfare, one that defeated empires before they could draw their swords. In 1 week, without a bullet, NATO had erased Putin's western front, dismantled his alliance, and shattered his myth. The world did not cheer, it did not celebrate. It simply watched in the same stunned quiet that follows a great storm as a man who once called himself invincible stood alone, surrounded not by enemies, but by the consequences of his own empire. And in that silence, the empire of fear breathed its last.